Hi, this is Catherine Bierstein from Blue Metal, and this video tutorial is about auto-scheduling in Project Professional 2016. Okay, to get started here, we're going to note that automatically out of the box, Project Professional is manually scheduled. But we're going to change that right now in the options to make that auto-scheduled. The other thing you want to note here is that the default task type is fixed units. There's fixed units, fixed duration, and fixed work. We'll be discussing those and how they automatically calculate tasks in Project Professional today a little bit later. Okay, so let's create a couple of tasks here. Note that project gives you an estimated duration of 1 day. We can make that 2 days. And then if you have several that have the same duration, you can just click on the edge there and drag down and do all of them at once. Now notice whenever I change anything, you get a blue background showing you what's changed. Okay, so let's assign this to some resource names. We can simply type in the names like this, and it's going to create those on the resource sheet. However, if we want to create a resource that's not 100% available, we need to go to View, to the resource sheet, and create it here. Now what does this mean? I've always found this max units terminology quite confusing. Really what this means is availability per day for the user. So since we have a calendar, we're using the default calendar which assigns 8 hours of work per day. 100% is 8 hours. It's that simple. So if a person is part-time, they only work half days, you put in 50%. They're available 4 hours a day. Okay, so let's go back to the Gantt chart. Let's link these right now. You can simply select the 3 tasks and go to Task and click the link button. So when you link tasks, a number of automatic things happen. First of all, you do see the blue color that indicates that something has changed about these tasks. Predecessors are automatically assigned. It's automatically assigned a finish to start type, although it doesn't indicate it. This is the default. So one task has to finish before the next one starts. Okay. Then if we look at the details and we look at task form, you can see here that we have a view that shows us the resource name, the units, and the work. So it was 100% units, 2 days, 8 hours per day, 16 hours of work. And it shows us the predecessor, task 1, and here where you can see the finish to start. Okay, also notice that you have other views here that you can just simply right click and move among them. I tend to be in the work one a lot. So it shows 16 hours of work, 16 hours of remaining work. Okay, now that we have a few tasks, let's look at some other views here. For instance, the resource usage. Okay, note that this indicates the hours per day here. So it shows 8 hours on Monday, Tuesday, 8 hours Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And it jumps over the weekends, of course, because the calendar says that weekends are non-working days. Okay, then if we note that that is by the resource, it's grouped by the person. Now if we go to task usage, it's grouped by the task. And you see the same view over here on the right. Okay, so let's go back and add a task for our part-time worker, Sally. And you can just, at this point, since she's already on the resource sheet, you can just click the drop down, click Sally, and notice that she goes in as 50% because she's only available 50% of the time. So let's link this task to the previous task. And the way we can do that is simply type in the task number. It's another way to do it. And notice that Sally, if we look in the resource usage, has been assigned 4 hours a day because she's a 50% worker. So one thing to be aware of is that tasks are scheduled from the start of the project when you're in automatic scheduling, but you can change that at any time. So say I change this to 2 weeks ago, and automatically all of the tasks change, so be aware of that. Now if I put in a new task, it's going to go to that start date, which is probably not what you want, but as soon as you link it to another task, it's going to line up where it should be. So that's not really a concern. So we see the basics of auto scheduling in Project Professional 2016. So let's dive into the actual calculations that it makes. There are 3 calculation values that Project Professional uses: duration, units, and work. Duration is simple. It's the days or partial days it will take to complete a task. Units is the number of hours a person works per day expressed as a percentage. And work is the total number of hours assigned to a task. So that simple calculation of duration times assignment units equals work is how Project Professional calculates work. So if you have 1 week, which is 5 days, that's the duration, times 100% assignment units, 8 hours a day, that equals 5 times 8 equals 40 hours of work. Simple. It gets a little more complicated if you have 2 resources assigned to a task. Say you have a 3-day duration. It would be 3 days times 200% assignment units, or 8 hours times 2 people, which equals 16 hours. So you would get 3 times 16 equals 48 hours of work. You can choose to use one of 3 task types in your project: fixed work, fixed units, and fixed duration. And what this allows you when you set the task type is to fix the value so that when you change one of the other values, the fixed value stays the same. So here I have a chart below Project Professional that shows how task types calculate. It basically has 2 axes here, the task types on the left and the values on the top. So for instance, if you have a fixed duration task type and you change the assignment units, it'll change the work. So we're going to show how each of these work, and of course we're not going to change the value for the fixed value for the task types. We're just going to change the other ones. Okay, so we have up here 6 tasks, and we've got fixed duration, 2 fixed duration, 2 fixed units, and 2 fixed work, and they're 2 days each, so it's 16 hours of work for each task. And over here on my resource usage, you'll notice that I'm using this resource usage custom view. It's the same as the resource view. I've just added the assignment units and peak so we can see what happens with them. Okay, so if I change the fixed duration 1 and I change assignment units, the work is going to change. So say I go to units, I'm changing it to 150%. I say OK, and yes, in fact, the work has changed. Now the duration is the same, so when I go to look at that in resource usage, the person has now been assigned 12 hours a day because it's 150%, 4 hours plus 8 equals 12. Okay, so let's go back here and let's change the fixed duration to. And this is kind of a strange word for a lot of people, this peak. When we change the work, so say I change this to 32 hours, the duration is going to stay the same, and the chart says that peak changes. What does that mean? Well, we see first of all that it's over allocated, of course, because it's over this 8 hours a day. So when we go to resource usage, we see the peak is 200% for this task. And that's because we added another 16 hours of work, so it's 200%. But the assignment unit stays the same at 100. Now up here on our first task where we change the assignment units, the peak is also is 150%, but the assignment units is also 150%, which to me is a little confusing, because when you go back to the Gantt chart, you see that it says for this task 150%, and where this task you would think, well, that task is really 200%. Why isn't it showing that? Because we changed assignment units here and we changed work here. We didn't change assignment units. So it's, it displays it a little strangely, but it's just what this peak is just an internal calculation for project. It's the maximum percentage or number of units for which a resource is assigned at any time for tasks. So it's actually a temporary value that it uses in its calculations, so you don't really need to worry about it. Okay, so that's pretty much as we expected. Let's see what happens with the fixed units. We go to number 1 fixed units here and say we change the duration. Then that's going to change the work, because the fixed units, 100%, 8 hours a day, think of it that way, is going to stay the same. So let's change the duration. And the fixed units are still 100%. The work is 24 hours. So changing the fixed units duration to 3 days changed the work as we expected. Okay, on fixed units 2, if we change the work instead, then the duration will change, which is the opposite of what we just did. So that makes sense. Say we change this to 24. The units are the same, so then that changes to 3 days. So basically we get the same effect either way. Okay, so let's change the last ones here, fixed work 1. If we change the duration, we're going to get this peak again. So let's change this to 3 days and see what happened here in resource usage. So here it is. Here's fixed work 1, and we see the work stays the same at 16 hours, but the peak has changed to 67%. So this is a temporary assignments unit value is what it is. Okay. All right, so in the last one here, fixed work, we're going to change the assignment units and the duration will change. Okay, so let's change the assignment units to say 200% and say OK. And the duration has changed to 1 day. And we have an over allocation. So we change the assignment units to 200%, and the work stays the same, which is 16 hours, and the duration changed to 1 day, because now you're going to do all that work in 1 day. So if we look at fixed work 2, the person is now going to work that whole 16 hours in 1 day, because we had fixed the work and changed the assignment units. Before we leave the subject of task type, I want to point out one thing that's very important. Don't change the fixed value of the task type. So as we've seen, task types allow you to fix one of the values, change one of the other 2 values, and then project calculates the third option. You do not want to change the fixed value of the task type you're using. This can result in very weird calculations, which I'm going to show you right now. So now I'm going to show you what happens when you change the fixed value of your fixed task type. Right here I've got 3 tasks. They're all fixed units. And if I go into my resource usage, I see that task 1 has 24 hours for 3 days. And it's 100% assignment units on 100% peak. So this is fixed units. So if I change the fixed unit here, I'm changing the part that's supposedly supposed to stay the same. It's supposed to be fixed. So I changed that to 150%. And the chart says that changing the assignment units in a fixed units task type will change the duration. Okay, let's see if that's true. And it did. It changed it to 2 days. And it shows that the John is over allocated now, and that it's 150% of units. Okay, so I go in and I see that those 3 days of 8 hours has changed to 12 hours a day. And note that the other tasks have moved forward 1 day because they are linked. Okay, now I'm going to show you what can go wrong with this situation. Now we're starting out with the same tasks, except note that the first task is 2 days instead of 3. So when we go to the resource usage, we see that there's 8 hours on 2 days. Okay, so what if I do the same thing? Again, if I change the fixed units, assignment units in a fixed units task type, the duration will change. Okay, so I've got task 1, and I'm going to make the units do it like I did before. Say I make that 150%. Again, we get an allocation over allocation, and it says the duration is now 1.33 days. Let's look at what the resource usage looks like. And you can see this looks pretty crazy. We have 12 hours and then 4 hours, and then the other 2 tasks were changed to some odd hours like 533 and 2.67. So why did that happen? Well, it's because they're linked. And project tries to do the best that it can to keep the finish to start relationship correct. And it doesn't really do a great job. So this is why you don't want to change the fixed parameter of a fixed task type. Alright, so now let's talk about what happens when we add a resource to a task. I've got 3 tasks here, and they're fixed units, fixed work, and fixed duration. So we'll see that when we add a resource, the fixed value is still honored. Okay, so just let's look at resources here. It's 8888, very simple, 100% assignment units and peak. Okay, so if I go on to the fixed units and I add another person to this, Dan, I now have 16 hours and 16 hours, so it basically doubled the work because I now have 2 people doing 16 hours, 8 hours a day. Now note with the action button, it gives me the other options, the 2 other options. I can reduce the duration but keep the same amount of work, which would make it 1 day for 2 people at 8 hours. Or I can reduce the hours of work per day, units, and keep the same duration of work. So they would both work 4 hours a day. So it gives you those options. So it's as long as you're changing it up here in the table rather than down here in the task form, you will get the button. Okay, so let me just take that out. Now let's take our attention to this little checkbox right here, effort driven. This is very useful because if you want to add a resource, you want to keep the work the same. If you click on that, and now if I add Dan, it's going to keep the hours the same, 16. It's going to give them both 8 hours of work, so the work will be done in 1 day. Again, you have the action button where you can do any of the 3 actions, but it's saying, effort driven is saying, I want to keep the work the same. Okay, so let me get out of that. Alright, so what if I go to the fixed work? Well, this is something I did not point out before, but the effort driven is chosen by default and it's grayed out, so you cannot change it. And that's because when you have fixed work, the work is always fixed, so it is effort driven just by the type of task type that is. Okay, so if I come up here and I add Dan, we're going to see what we expect. It's going to go to 1 day duration, and it's going to be 8 hours for each person because it's fixed work. Okay, so let's get rid of that, just Control Z. So on the fixed duration task, if I add Dan, we get something very similar to the fixed units. It's 16 hours a day for 2 people, and the duration is fixed, so it's 2 days. Let me Control Z to cancel that out. If I click the effort driven, and then I add Dan, I still keep the 2 days, but now they have 8 hours of work because I have a fixed duration. So they're only going to work 4 hours a day. So it's honoring my 2 days. And it's keeping the work the same, which is 16. So let's talk about task relationships now, because that's another thing that affects auto-scheduling. I've got some tasks, 5 tasks set up here with various days of duration, just so they'll spread out a bit here on the time phase portion of the view so that we can see when we make the changes how that affects it. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that every automatically scheduled task by default has a finish to start relationship. So when this task finishes, then the next one will start. So this finishes and that one will start. That's not always what you want. So how can we change that? Okay, well, let's keep this one a finish to start. Note that I have down here the resources and predecessors view chosen down here in the task form. So that's the default, finish to start. So the next one is I've labeled as start to start. So I can change that type right here, start to start. And when I say OK, you see what happens. So now the predecessor for task 3 and task 3 are lining up because they're both starting at the same time. And you see the blue has all the times, all the tasks have changed. They've moved in to honor that relationship. Okay, and notice that in the predecessor column now you see SS, start to start. Okay, so another fairly common task relationship is finish to finish task. Now this would be like a situation where you have a room that some work is going in and it's not available after a certain date because you rented it or something. So both the tasks in there have to finish at the same time. So I would come down here and simply choose finish to finish. Click OK. And now we can see the arrow is the time that task 3 and task 4 are finishing is the same because it's finish to finish, and I see FF in the predecessor. Okay, and the last one, start to finish, is very rarely used because it's the opposite of finish to start. But you can use this, and you would simply come down here and choose start to finish. And you're going to get an error here because it said you moved task 5 of project 7 to start Thursday, July 6th. This is before the start of the project. So it's giving you a warning about that and saying, is that what you really want to do? If you say OK, it's actually going to move it there and it starts before the project. And then when I go to the project, the start date is still the 10th, but that task is starting before the start date. So that's all there is to the task relationships. Fairly simple to understand. Okay, finally, let's talk about lag and lead time and constraints. Sometimes something happens to your schedule and you have to wait. For instance, say you're waiting for something to come in the mail and you still want to keep your items linked, your tasks linked, but you want to indicate that you're waiting. You can use lag time. So like on task 3 here, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say there's a lag time of 3 days. And note what project does. It changes the predecessors to say 2 is the predecessor. It's a finish to start, but there's going to be a 3-day lag time between the predecessor 2 and the successor 3. Alternatively, there might be times when something can start earlier than you anticipated. You can use a minus lag time, which is known as a lead time, for that. So if I go down here and I put in minus 2 days and say OK, it's going to say FS because it's a finish to start, but minus 2 days. And over here in the time phase portion, you're going to see the arrow, and it's going to move over 2 days. Okay. So what about constraints? Constraints are where you have tasks that must honor certain dates. So let's take a look at that. Go to the Advanced tab here in the task information and look at the constraint types here. All tasks have a constraint type of as soon as possible, unless the project is starting from the finish date, and then it would be as late as possible. And there are no constraint dates associated with those two constraint types. There are 4 semi-flexible constraint types: finish no earlier than, finish no later than, start no earlier than, and start no later than, that are pretty self-explanatory. So let's say give a finish no later than constraint to this task, and it's going to give me a planning wizard warning that this could result in a scheduling conflict. So I'm going to say continue, and as soon as I do that, I get a indicator saying this task has a finish no later than constraint on Friday the 21st. Okay, so what if I change this to say I have a duration of 7 days? Well, I have that constraint, so instead of moving it over 1 day, it's going to move it back 1 day because I have a constraint on Friday the 21st to finish no later than. So we might be tempted to consider another type of constraint. The must finish on one is one that a lot of people consider, but it's really not recommended. A better idea is to choose a deadline date. So say I want to have a deadline on the finish date of this task, which is August 10th. Now when I do that, I get in the time phase over here. It's a little hard to see, but there's a arrow here that is indicating that there is a deadline set. And when I try to go beyond this deadline, I immediately get a white exclamation point in a red triangle, which is very noticeable, that says this task goes past its deadline on Thursday, August 10th. So that's a better solution for that. So that's it for our tutorial on auto scheduling, and I hope you learned a lot. And this book I really recommend that you get, this Microsoft Project 2016. It's available from Amazon for only $14.40 in the Kindle version, which you can just read on your PC. You don't need to have a Kindle, and it goes through step by step almost everything. So I really recommend that you get it. Thanks for listening.